So if the leaks are true, then there's a good chance that we'll see our first look at Resident Evil 9 sometime this year. More than likely, probably this summer. So with that in mind, I figured now's the time to give you guys a peek at my wish list for this game. Full disclosure, most of the things I'm going to be talking about today on today's video are probably very unlikely, but hey, I can dream, right? Also, I'm going under the assumption that this is the final numbered entry and that it'll close some chapters while setting up the future of the franchise. So I'll be discussing story elements, gameplay mechanics, and other features that I hope Capcom includes and what seems to be the final numbered entry of the franchise. Before that though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel if you like the content that I bring you guys. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But with that out of the way, this is Nerd Space Games with 10 things that I want to see in Resident Evil 9. Let's get it. Number 10, 2 scenarios, 2 campaigns. Something I've been wanting to see the franchise do since Resident Evil 6 is the inclusion of multiple scenarios and campaigns. Granted, Resident Evil 6 is not exactly the model that I want them to follow, as I wasn't a fan of how it was handled in that game. If anything, I'm looking more at how the classic Resident Evil 2 game handled things. Sure, I like the 2 scenarios to connect and feel different, but ultimately, I wouldn't mind the inclusion of some sort of zapping system or the fact that a decision you make in one campaign could change certain aspects of your second campaign. That was a feature that I've always really enjoyed in the original Resident Evil 2, and when the remake removed most of those mechanics, I was honestly a little disappointed. As for who we would follow, well, considering the events of Village, I would assume that Chris Redfield is one of the 2 playable protagonists. As for the other, I can't think of anybody better than the person that was with Chris at the start of everything, Jill Valentine. Considering that she's a BSAA agent as well, and she's probably the person within the agency that Chris trusts the most, it shouldn't be too difficult to imagine Resident Evil 9 focusing on both of them as the playable protagonists. And it would be the perfect way to close this chapter since it all started with the 2 of them back in the Spencer Mansion during the events of the first game. Number 9, the enemies. When you think about the entire series, Resident Evil has explored so many different variations of enemies in the past. From the traditional infected zombies to the folklore-inspired Lycans, the franchise has changed a lot since the 90s. And if we were to continue the pattern that Village set us on, then it's quite possible that we will see RE9's enemies come in the form of other mythical creatures. Stuff like the Wendigos or Skinwalkers, both of which have already been rumored to appear in the next entry. However, I'm kinda pretty tired of the mold and the BOWs that mirror creatures of legend. Instead, I kinda wanna go back to the roots of the franchise and see more traditional infected creatures, but in different forms. For example, I would like to see more animals affected with the viruses similar to the T virus or the G virus. Hell, we can even explore multiple different viruses in the same game if the setting turns out to fit a certain narrative. Like imagine infected bears, other insects, and so on. On top of that, it would be cool to see some abominations created due to mixing different viruses together. Like imagine what would happen if we took the G virus and mixed it with samples from the mold. I've enjoyed the fact that Resident Evil has always explored different monsters and BOWs throughout the franchise, but if this truly is going to be the final chapter of the numbered entries, then I would like to see it explore some monsters created from the original T virus and G virus to some extent in RE9. Number 8, the return of Ada Wong. Leaked concept art for Village revealed that Ada Wong was initially supposed to appear in the latest entry of the series. Unfortunately, that concept was scrapped and we never got to see her in the game. But it does make you wonder as to what Ada's motive could have been if she did appear in Resident Evil Village. Her costume took inspiration from the Plague Doctor design, which left us to assume that she was there in disguise in an effort to retrieve samples from the mold. Knowing Ada's career and her past, chances are that she was sent there by some sort of company, one of which could have been the Connections, and that they hired her to collect samples from Mother Miranda's experiments. So it wouldn't be too far-fetched to find Ada asserting herself into RE9 with the same motivations. And Ada could prove to be a very interesting anti-hero working against Chris and Jill throughout the events of RE9, even if Chris was made aware of the true circumstances surrounding the events of RE6. Chances are that he'll still have a problem with Ada as she works on the black market and selling samples of different viruses, which are then used to create BOWs, the very thing that Chris and the BSAA have sworn to fight against. Plus, thanks to the remake's version of Separate Ways, Ada Wong has become pretty popular again, to the point where Capcom could capitalize on a future DLC of RE9 that follows Ada throughout the events of that game. And for any of you that assume Ada won't appear in a Resident Evil game without Leon, well, keep in mind what I said earlier. Ada was originally planned to appear in Village, a game that didn't have Leon Kennedy anywhere near the project. So obviously Capcom has no problem with bringing Ada into the story without her star-crossed lover. One of the biggest debates right now about the future of the franchise focuses on the gameplay, with the remakes going back to third person over the shoulder perspectives, and both RE7 and Village putting the player in first person. Fans have been at odds with each other as to how Capcom should handle the next numbered entry. Some say that Capcom should finish off the trilogy with one last first person game, while others have favored the over the shoulder perspective in the remakes so much that Capcom even implemented it in Resident Evil Village over a year after its initial release. With that being said, it's completely up in the air as to how Capcom should handle this next entry. Me? I say why not both? I mean, we've seen it done multiple times already for the franchise, just not right at launch. Think back to what I said about Village. The initial release of the game was in first person, and then a year later we saw a third person mode added to the game. Even Resident Evil 4 sort of meets that requirement too. Well, technically, as the first person mode was actually a VR mode for RE4 Remake, but still a somewhat similar concept. My point is that it's obviously possible to make both of these perspectives available at launch, so I don't see why Capcom wouldn't do it to appease both sides of the fanbase. But if Capcom was really going to do one perspective at release, then my money is on third person for a few reasons. For one, first person was significant to Ethan Winters. While we played as Chris in first person during small segments of each game, the perspective was used to make us feel like we were in the shoes of Ethan Winters. That's a major reason why both of these games shied away from revealing Ethan's face. Another reason why I think they'll prioritize third person over first person comes from the add-ons of Village. Keep in mind that the game added a third person mode to it a whole year later, plus even included a story DLC following Rose Winters that was also in third person. For that reason, it seems like Capcom is hinting towards third person over the shoulder perspectives for all future titles, with the exception of VR modes for each game. But hey, I'm all for including both perspectives at launch. And if they really want to get the fans cheering, then include a fixed camera angle too, but that's extremely unlikely, let's be real. Number 6, the Redfields reunited. In Resident Evil, there are 4 main characters that have come to be known as the Core 4. Of those 4, 2 of them are siblings, Claire and Chris Redfield. Strangely enough, these characters have only appeared in one game and one animated movie together. And with RE9 being rumored to be the final chapter of this saga of Resident Evil games, then it wouldn't feel right to not have Chris and Claire reunited, even if it's just for a moment. Now look, I want to clarify that I'm not looking for Claire to be a playable character. I mean, I definitely don't want RE9 to end up like RE6, where they tried to include too many campaigns in one game and it became a clusterfuck. Instead, I just want a small cameo from Claire. Perhaps before Chris heads to HQ, he meets with Claire first. Recognizing how dangerous this mission is, maybe he wants to see her first, or better yet, maybe she's been captured by the BSAA and she's being used as leverage against Chris. So Claire could be trapped throughout most of the game while Chris and his team set out to rescue her. There is one other story bit that I think would be more likely, and it would kill 2 birds with 1 stone on this list, but I'll cover that when I get to it later on. Overall, having Claire and Chris reunite even briefly seems like a no-brainer for a game that is rumored to close one chapter while also setting up for the future. Number 5, the truth behind the BSAA. At the end of Village, we were left with a cliffhanger that pointed to the BSAA, an organization that has opposed BOWs in most Resident Evil games, has started to use their own BOWs to carry out some of their missions. Upon realizing this, Chris and his team immediately set their sights on the BSAA headquarters, which is located somewhere in the United Kingdom. For that reason, one would assume that a major location of RE9 will take place in and around the headquarters of BSAA. What really has me intrigued by this concept is that now that we know they are using BOWs, there's a high probability that they have a secret lab testing different viruses and parasites on subjects. So I'm hoping this means that we're about to enter a facility that is full of different monsters and BOWs created from all the different viruses and parasites that we faced off against throughout the series. From the molded to the T-virus, we could see all kinds of monstrosities buried deep within the headquarters of the BSAA. And this kind of combines with something I talked about earlier, but imagine some of the monsters that may have been created from two different forms of viruses. This facility could turn out to be the ultimate cocktail of BOWs, as it'll mix in different monsters that we've seen throughout the franchise. Something like this sounds like a dream come true, so if this is true, man, can you imagine the potential? Of course, I don't want the characters to be stuck in a single building or lab throughout the entire game, which leads into my next entry for this list. Number 4, the setting. So I've already started it with the last entry, but ideally I love for the central point of RE9 to focus on the BSAA headquarters that has a secret lab underneath it to test all the different viruses, parasites, and the molded that we've encountered throughout the franchise. What I haven't covered yet though is the circumstances of the headquarters prior to Chris and his team arriving there. So the only thing that we know about the location of the headquarters is that it's somewhere in the UK. Because the location is hidden, I would assume that it's not located in a major city, but instead a small town where the residents are all employees of the BSAA. This would be how they've managed to keep the location of HQ hidden from the public for so long. Perhaps because Chris learns that the BSAA are creating BOWs, a high-ranking official or someone running the organization behind the scenes may have made the executive decision to cause an outbreak in this facility, which ultimately infected headquarters and the small town around it. This infection could also leak out to nearby wildlife, giving us some unique infected animals to face off against. So upon arriving at the town, Chris and his team are dispatched with the goal of retrieving evidence that incriminates the BSAA and to find out who's been calling the shots to mass produce BOWs. With the town surrounding HQ and the secret lab underneath it, there's a lot of potential for this setting. Plus, it's kind of poetic in terms of it being the last numbered entry, as this location will have a lot of similarities to Raccoon City and Umbrella's secret lab. Number 3, the main villain. One of the most important parts of any horror game is the villain. And with this potentially being the last numbered entry, then the main antagonist of the game needs to be a damn good one. So let's say we're going off of everything I've said so far. On paper, the BSAA looks to be the antagonist of RE9 as they are developing BOWs and Chris and his team are taking the fight directly to their HQ. So I would assume whoever is the head of the BSAA, or at least whomever is in charge of creating the BOWs within the BSAA, will turn out to be the main villain of the game. And personally, I would find it to be much more interesting if this person is either connected or is someone from a previous Resident Evil game. I mean, the perfect villain for the last numbered entry would be someone like Albert Wesker, but let's be real for a second. The man was killed in a volcano after being shot with I repeat, two rocket launchers. And I don't know how I would feel about the idea that the Wesker killed in the volcano was a clone, so let's just ignore that possibility. Instead, I would like to turn it over to someone else that has been involved in just about every Resident Evil game, albeit it was mostly behind the scenes. I give you Oswald E. Spencer. Before you guys start smashing those keyboards, telling me that Wesker killed him, hear me out. Spencer is probably the ultimate mastermind. When you think about everything Umbrella has created and going one step farther, everything that was inspired and improved from Spencer's research, then it's clear to see that Spencer would make one hell of a final villain if he were still alive. So here's my theory about how he could still be alive, and I'll admit it's a stretch. So Spencer has always been motivated with the idea of ruling the world as a god, to which he wanted to lead the human race into a new age of evolution. So his entire life was dedicated to this dream. Ultimately, despite creating some insane BOWs and other immortal-like creatures, Spencer never achieved this goal. But this is Oswald E. Spencer that we're talking about. I can't imagine a man like this didn't do enough research to find a way to prolong his life in the event that his body gave out on him, which is why I think he took a page from Mother Miranda's book. By that, I mean he found a way to transfer his consciousness into a different host, like how Eva's consciousness lived on in the mold. Perhaps Spencer found the secret of that, and in the event of his death, his consciousness would be transferred into the mold, which then would be transferred into a younger body as host. And my thought process is that this younger Oswald E. Spencer went by a different name and rose up in the ranks to lead the research division within the BSAA. Hell, over time, maybe he found a way to take over the division or even the BSAA as a whole altogether. Considering Spencer's connection to just about every villain and BOW throughout the franchise, he would make the perfect villain for the last numbered entry of the series. Of course, this theory is kind of far-fetched, but man, imagine if it did happen. Number 2, death of a core 4 member. Earlier, I talked about how Resident Evil has 4 main characters that have come to be known as the Core 4. This group includes Chris and Claire Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Leon S. Kennedy. Now, while I don't know if Leon makes a lot of sense to return in RE9, I do think there's a strong possibility that we'll see the other 3 in the next entry of the series, especially with it potentially being the last numbered entry. But one thing that the franchise has always been hesitant about is killing the main characters. With the exception of Ethan Winters, Capcom has a thing about not killing off returning playable protagonists. But with RE9 being rumored as the last numbered entry, then I can't think of a better time than now to have one of the franchise's most beloved characters pay the ultimate price. As for who that person should be, well, in order for it to have some major impact on the fans, I think it should be one of the Core 4. And in my opinion, only one of them actually makes the most sense: Claire Redfield. I know. It's unfortunate that she makes the most sense, considering that she's the character that Capcom has kind of done dirty the most. I mean, she hasn't been included in a numbered entry outside of Resident Evil 2. But when you think about the other 3 members of the Core 4, then it's kind of hard to picture Capcom actually killing them off in RE9. I've already clarified that Leon is probably the least likely of the 4 to even show up in the game, and when you add in the fact that he's kind of Capcom's golden boy, then it's close to damn near impossible to see him dying in RE9. Chris, on the other hand, has already been confirmed to be alive 16 years into the future thanks to the post-credits scene in Village, which just leaves Jill and Claire. Now, while I can see Jill making a lot of sense, I think there's one thing that prevents me from thinking that Capcom will kill her off. And it's actually thanks to the reveal in Death Island, the latest CGI movie. As it turns out, Jill's encounter with both Nemesis and Wesker's mind control device has left her with some side effects. Jill physically ages slower than any other character in the franchise. For Capcom to reveal such a major plot point that basically allows Jill to stay young for future games and movies, in my opinion, hints to them wanting to use her more in the future. So that just leaves our girl Claire Redfield. How she dies, I'm not sure. But I do believe that the BSAA captures her and uses her as leverage against Chris, and at some point we'll find her sacrificing herself to save her brother or Jill. There were some leaks earlier on during the making of RE9 that pointed to Claire potentially being killed in the beginning of the game, but none of which have been proven, and I don't know if I completely buy into that leak. Still, I do think it makes a lot of sense for Claire to meet a tragic end in Resident Evil 9. Number 1, Stars Survivors Reunited. The biggest dream that I have for this upcoming game is the fact that it'll reunite the surviving Stars members. As I've stated multiple times, Chris is heading into the BSAA headquarters to where he'll have to learn the truth behind the BSAA and the reason why they are creating BOWs now. With that being said, Chris is going to need people that he can trust. We already know that Jill Valentine is probably the person he trusts the most, and she's also in the BSAA, so it seems like a no-brainer that she'll be involved with this invasion on BSAA headquarters. But outside of his own Wolfhound squad and Sheva Alamar from the African division of the BSAA, he doesn't exactly have many people within the agency that he can trust, which means that we could see Chris reaching out to people outside of the agency that he can trust. People like the original Stars team from the first game, which included Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and Rebecca Chambers. Now listen, I know this is probably a pipe dream, but come on. Death Island, the CGI movie, already included 3 out of 4 of the members, so why can't we get Barry in the next team up event and make it a perfect set? Sure, Chris could reach out to people like Leon, Parker, and Sheva as well, but I can't think of anything more iconic than the reunion of the Stars for one final mission against BOWs. And if Capcom did go this route, it's possible they might leave Claire out of it and make one of the Stars survivors pay the ultimate sacrifice instead. But that does it for today's episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you guys think of my list of things that I want to see in Resident Evil 9. Obviously, some of them, like the resurrection of Spencer and the reunion of Stars, are kind of out there, but hey, that's what dreams are for. Let me know what crazy, insane things you would like to see happen in the next Resident Evil mainline game. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more rankings like this one. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.